Okay, so this is me, Chris Lilly. I work for W3C, World Wide Web Consortium. My current job title is Technical Director of the Interaction Domain, whatever that means. Previously I still am in fact, Graphics Activity Lead, also Fonts Activity Lead, and assorted other dog's body jobs. So what I'm here to talk about today is fonts, in particular fonts and CSS, and also how that affects LibreGraphics programs, which it does in certain ways. Both CSS affecting the programs and programs affecting CSS. Okay, so the slides are not online currently, but they will be as soon as I get off the stage because I finished writing them like 10 minutes ago. Okay. So type. It's come a long way since sort of a stick and setting bits of metal and tamping them all in with little bits of brass and all that sort of stuff. There's been a few changes in the technology since then. So really this talk is not about type in general or fonts in general, but of course it's about fonts in an electronic medium and particularly on the web. Shouldn't come as a surprise to you, but there we are. So let's look at font names. They have these wonderful resounding names. Firecracker is just something I made up, but the whole ultra black, Abiq, demi book, ultra bold, whatever, etc. All that stuff looks suspiciously like it's some sort of classification system, doesn't it? I mean, it does look as if, you know, if it says ultra bold, then it's really black, and if it says demi light, then it's lighter, and blah blah blah. And you could sort of imagine trying to intuit the characteristics of a font from its name, and you would be wrong. I couldn't find it for this, but way back in like '96 or whatever, someone from Adobe did an analysis of all the fonts in the Adobe Font Library, and they rendered a couple of characteristic glyphs and counted the number of black pixels and the number of white pixels, and tried to correlate that with the name. And there was a sort of cloud-like, vaguely, you know, it's not completely uncorrelated, but it's not anywhere good enough that you could actually do anything useful with it. In a desktop publishing program, what you typically do is you mark a piece of text with your cursor, and you say, slap this font on it, please, and that's it, and you're done. And if there's any text that doesn't have font on it, then you'll see and you'll correct it. And then you send it to paper, and the person reading the paper doesn't actually care how the fonts came to be there, they just look at the result. Now, when you start doing something like that online, and in particular when you're using a structured medium, such as this totally made-up bit of XML here, you will see that if I put Firecracker Ultra Black Oblique on the root foo element, and then on the bar element, I say I want a lighter weight. And then on the baz element, I say I want it to be not italic anymore, and I also want to change the font family to Squib. So what's the complete font name now? Is it Squib semi-black non-italic? Or what is it called? You can't actually go that way. So what CSS did is instead to take each font and analyze it and fill in a table of properties. That's not a complete list, but that's just an example. So there's a font family, and then there's a font weight, which is in fact taken straight from OpenType, the 100 to 900 scale. That was completely taken from there. And a font style, italic, oblique, normal. Font stretch, condensed and expanded and so on. At the time that this work was happening, which was 96, 97, the type world was a lot more primitive than it is now. Fonts were typically holding up to 256 glyphs, and if you wanted to have small caps or condensed or whatever, it would often be unclear as to whether it was really in the same family or not, because it was all different fonts anyway. So you'd have a bold and an oblique, and you'd have a condensed, oblique, and etc. They'd all be separate fonts. So this actually fitted fairly well at the time. Fits a little less well now. So, okay, that's the properties that we have. And then the idea is that if you put that on some structured text, all you're doing is changing one property at a time. And then to actually find out what font that corresponds to, you go back to your table and say, give me a font that has these properties. So that's sort of okay. It's still better, the mapping still works better in one direction than in the other. So people said, yeah, this looks like a good direction, this is a sort of analysis thing. So XSL, the XML style language, took the same set of font properties and so on. I believe there's an ISO standard 9541 or something which also used the same approach. And several open source programs. Is anyone here from Pango? Because I'm going to be mentioning it occasionally. No? Oh dear. I'm going to be mentioning it occasionally. I'd really like someone to tell me that's wrong immediately when I went wrong, but I'll just blunder on ahead and hope for the best. So various people thought this was a good idea. Various platform libraries started organizing themselves in a similar way, which is good as far as it goes, but there are problems. A quote here from Gail Carmichael, well, as she was at the time, Gail Carmichael now. She was trying to look at Pango in the context of Inkscape, and she said that the problem is that Pango has all this information about fonts, and then it throws some of it away because it doesn't fit into the CSS model, and that means that Inkscape can't actually expose any functionality that CSS doesn't have. Now you might think, oh well, that's not really a problem. I'm using Inkscape to make SVG, and SVG can't do anything that CSS can't do, so well, that's okay then. Which is fine if your model is Inkscape is a program to let me make SVG. If your model is Inkscape is a program to let me do graphics, which happens to use this format, which I don't actually care about, and which I'm then going to convert into PDF and print anyway, then that obviously is more of a disadvantage. So what sort of problems are there? Oops. So CSS doesn't fully describe the richness of fonts at all. Even for Latin, there's things like swash, alternates, old style figures, this sort of thing. Platforms can in fact limit the available weights, even though OpenType and CSS say that there is this weight scale that may not actually work in practice. The mapping from properties back to a font name is an issue. Going the other way is fine. You can take a given font and fill in its properties, but obviously you could have more than one font that corresponds to a given set of properties, and then if you want to go back, it's not clear which one you should use. So just to show that this isn't actually a theoretical concern, so this is an HTML file embedded in the SVG, and it's explicitly calling out for the 9 different weights. And it's using a font, a free font, free in the sense of you can use it, free font, which has 6 weights, which is unusual. Lots of fonts have only 2 weights, or in some cases 1. And you can see that in this rendering, so this is using Windows and Uniscribe and that sort of stuff, it in fact decided it's going to give me 2 of those weights, and the rest I can just, they're just not going to be there. I have seen this working. It sort of works sometimes on a Mac, and it sort of works sometimes on Linux, depending on what the underlying system is. But basically, it's a real pain because the spec has said this since '98 that it has these weights, and the OpenType spec has said it since whatever '94 or something. And yet, in practice, many systems don't let you get out all the different weights that you would want. Is this a techie audience? Should I view source and stuff? Yeah? Okay, let's try that. Okay, so we start with SVG, and we have a title and stuff. Then we have a foreign object, then we have some HTML, then we have a style sheet, which, as you can see, just has these classes and puts the equivalent weight on it. I pointed out that there are 6 weights, and there are 6 weights in the font and 9 weights asked for, which is fine because CSS tells you how to allocate all these. It gives you an example of how they're all allocated. When I was doing this was actually, I made this as a test for the CSS 2.1 test suite. And I was trying to, you have to have conformance criteria. And this comment at the end reveals my desperation. When I said, here are the weights, I've gone into a font editor and found what the weights are. And CSS says, the mappings are non-normative. The only testable normative statement is that, I can't read it. Basically, if you ask for something bolder, it can't be lighter. So you could actually be conformant using only 1 weight. There's nothing you can test. This is really stupid. This is really broken. I wasn't very happy when I discovered that. I was really happy when I got a font to use for the test suite that had 6 weights. and it was freely downloadable, and I mailed the designer, and they said, yes, that's fine, and you can convert it to SVG2, and you can redistribute it in the test suite. And I was like, yes, win, win, win. And then it's like, Okay, so that's one thing that's broken. Here's another example. So the bottom line there is a line of text in Urdu using the system's default font for Arabic. And the middle line is using a font called Nafiz Nastaliq, which I have installed on my system, which has a number of special OpenType features which let you do Urdu typography correctly. And it looks quite a bit nicer. The top line I will skip over quickly, so this is not the appropriate part in my talk, except to point out that it is actually trying to download a font off the web and failing, and I'll tell you why later. So we need more. Designers want more richness. The people who are using open source, Libre graphics, Libre programs in general, want more richness. CSS3 fonts is currently under development, and they're also looking to improve things. So comments are welcome. That's the mailing list there. We're style at w3.org. If you can think of useful ways in which the spec could be amended to allow you to get access to things like swashes and alternate forms and that sort of stuff, that would be great. We're looking for concrete suggestions, implementable suggestions on how to do that. Okay, so far all I've been talking about is fonts which are installed on your system, which is great. If you're running on a Mac, you've got this set of fonts, and if you're running on Windows, you've got that set of fonts, and if you're running on Linux, you've got whatever the distro gave you, and it may include the Microsoft ones depending on whether you're allowed to actually redistribute them or not, which it turns out you're not, which is a problem. In consequence, people have a very, very restricted set of fonts available for their use. When W3C started to move into mobile work, it got even worse. They're like, italic, bold, no, we have a font. It's a bitmap font, it comes in these 3 sizes, and it can't be changed, and by the way, the SVG renderer can't access the file system to ask if it has any other fonts anyway. It's like, but of course there is a technology to deal with that. So, web fonts. As you heard yesterday with the Open Font Library, web fonts, latest big thing, coming soon to you within a year. So you might think this is like something that's been dreamed up in the last 6 months. Actually not. So let's go back to prehistory, 1996. There was a fonts working group chaired by, unfortunately, myself. I say unfortunately because that was my first job at W3C, and I was all young and naive and thought all we had to do was solve technical problems. So that was at the point there was a war in font formats. On the one hand, there was PFR, Portable Font Resources, which was from Bitstream, which they were anxious to tell you was not a font, it was a resource, okay? So you could take a font and you could turn it into a resource without infringing anyone's IPR, okay? Kind of. And Netscape was using that in Netscape 4. They had a license agreement with Bitstream and they had that working. And that used the link element in HTML. That was all it used. And then the rest of it was sort of magic behind the scenes. And then there's OpenType, which was being jointly promoted by Adobe and Microsoft. I can't remember, I think Apple was involved at that time as well, but primarily it was Adobe and Microsoft who were pushing that. TrueType was already established, but OpenType was just coming up. And basically, when you get a bunch of these competitors in the room, they all block each other and they make sure that the other side can't get an advantage even if we don't move forward. So that was an eye-opener for me. But by concentrating on not the format but the other parts, we did manage to get some sort of agreement. As I say, this started off in a separate working group, then it merged into the CSS working group, with the result that CSS2 had this web fonts. This is 1998. It has this @font face thing, construct, which tells you there is a font somewhere, and here are its properties, which are called descriptors, to separate them from the properties that you use for styling. It allowed you to download fonts. It allowed you to synthesize fonts. So you could say, here are the characteristics of my font. Here's a Panos 1, and here's all the widths, and etc. And I'd like you to make a font that looks like this. And it allowed matching, again, which is a little bit less ambitious than synthesis. So it had all this stuff, So that meant people did actually expect you to put all the different widths of all the different glyphs inside your style sheet. And it's like, hey, that's going to be really big. Let's have a separate thing so you can download that before you download the font to get the bit of a mess, a bit over-engineered. One useful thing it did have was Unicode range, so you could say what the range of glyphs was. This is something that's been somewhat misunderstood. So, and I'll just look at my watch, I haven't bothered explaining it. How much time have I got left? Okay, I'll explain it later in the break. So this was not a success. There were two tools, one of which only ran on a Mac and one of which only ran on Windows, to make two different font formats just to support both browsers, which is how people talked in those days, with different syntax. And people were not interested. It just didn't take off at all. Mostly, except for some countries where the state of the web was so poor that this was the only solution that actually let them see text that they could read. So there are countries which use this, and in fact, there's currently a guy in India who has a business selling what he describes on his website as the new technology, which is actually Bitstream PFR fonts put onto basically a jumble of ASCII text to make it look like an Indian language. And there are major websites using that technology, which of course will not work in any other browser. I have heard it reported to me that these are IE specific sites. They're not. They're Netscape 4 specific sites with a JavaScript hack to make them work in IE. Okay, so SVG came along. 2001 was when it became a rec. And we had a problem there. People tended to have one of two hard choices. They would either select all the text which they had laid out and convert it to curves. So you keep the typographic richness of what you got, but it's no longer text. Or you say, and I'll approximate this with some other font which looks different and has different widths and all the text is going to collide, but at least it's text and you can search it and it's accessible. Not a good set of choices. What SVG fonts allows you to do is convert to curves, hang on to those curves and say this originally came from the glyph for this character. And that's really what the SVG fonts are. It's just a little bit of XML wrapped around those curves. But it did get widely implemented because we made it mandatory. We said you have to support the SVG format. You can support any other format you want. So, for example, the Adobe Viewer used SVG and CFF, which is it's an open type subset which only uses type 1 glyphs. Okay, nobody very much likes that. So I grayed out the synthesis and matching because we felt those were just features that weren't being used and weren't realistic, and we dropped them. So that actually worked quite well, and in lots of phones that use SVG, you'll find that the content you download either includes or links to a font, which, I mean, on a phone, you've only got room for a small amount of text anyway, so you can subset the font, and it works pretty well. So, bringing us more up to the present, CSS3 fonts drop synthesis and matching, just like SVG did, because that stuff basically doesn't work. It removes the small caps axes because you don't really have separate fonts that are small caps anymore. It's a feature, and we want to have more robust support for features in general. Various clarifications, enhancement, a test suite, unlike CSS2, which didn't ever have a test suite. CSS 2.1 is getting one. SVG does have one, but that's obviously quite important. So that brings us up to almost the present, where we have the same old diagram with OpenType on one side, but with a different set of protagonists downloading it, and Microsoft on the other side, still with embedded OpenType. And to be fair, OpenType is a format. Agfa microtype compression is a way of scrunching down that format, which is known to be patented. That IP moved to Monotype. Monotype and Microsoft jointly made a submission to W3C to document the EOT format, which is good because that means that people don't have to reverse engineer it, they can just look at the spec. The downside is that it's currently a note, and unless it becomes a RETRAC piece of work, it will not be royalty free. The W3C royalty free license only applies to recommendation status documents. So that gives us a quandary. If we make a working group, they can rush that through and produce a recommendation, make a test suite, There's already one implementation in IE. If we can get another one, then we look at the rec, and there we are, and we have it royalty free. On the downside, some people say that you shouldn't be using that anyway, and it's dangerous, and that it's DRM, and it's not DRM in the classical sense, as in there's an obfuscation algorithm which is documented in the spec, so it's not exactly going to be hard to unobfuscate. But on the other hand, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act doesn't really distinguish between how hard it is. Anything can be cause for falling off in irons. So it's not quite clear whether we should sort of embrace embedded OpenType or say, yeah, it's here, but don't use it, or what. On the other hand, if you're just downloading OpenType, the font foundries are saying, well, what stops someone putting like my entire catalog on the web and saying, here, guys, have that? Unfortunately, they've already done that. People have already done that anyway, so tricky. Which brings us on to font licensing. As far as I can see, these are the sort of 5 groups into which this fits. First of all, there's Libra. There's the stuff we heard about yesterday with the Open Font Library. So that means you've got the sources. It means you can extend the font. If there's glyphs missing, you can add it. If you don't like the way that, say, Cyrillic is done, you can take it, check out the Cyrillic and make your own version, say, here, I like this better, the remix thing. So that's the sort of optimum. Obviously, not everyone wants to do that, but where that can be done, that's wonderful. Then there's freely usable, often called free fonts. So what that means is someone's made a font and they said you can use it and you don't have to pay me. You still have a license. Often the license says this font must only be distributed in the zip file with this license text attached, and it may not be converted to another format, it may not be subsetted, blah, blah, blah. So you can point to it, you can use it, you can't do anything else with it. And then there's fonts which are licensed to specific sites. You can imagine that Coca-Cola would license a font that does Coca-Cola and swoopy stuff, and they use that on their site, and they don't want anyone else using it for, say, Pepsi or something. Presumably you'd have to chop half it off to make it say Pepsi, but anyway. And then there's the license that disallows online use. That's actually quite common. If you buy a font for printing, some of them say, this may not be used in PDF, this may not be used on the web, which is fine. You bought it, that's what it says you can use it for, fine, there's no problem with that, but you can't use it on the web. And there was a very colourful blog posting referred to yesterday about the consequences of that. And then, by far the largest group is where there is a license when you can find it, and it's extremely unclear what you can do with it. It talks about number of CPUs and number of printers and whatever, but it doesn't actually say what you can do with it. This doesn't necessarily align with whether it costs you money or not, by the way. I bought a font, Alphabetum, which is it's a font for people who do old history stuff. It's got, ancient whatevers, which I happen to be interested in. So I paid money for it, not a lot, but I paid money for it. But I am allowed to use it in PDF, the license says, and I am allowed to use it at web font, it says. Cool. So the fact that I paid for it, and I paid for it once, and I can now put it on the web and people can point to it, apparently. Okay, that works. So, current work. This isn't much help to you unless you have the slides in front of you, but CSS3 fonts, I gave a link to that spec. Most W3C working groups now work in the open, so the specs that they have are in a CVS base. You can look at the current state at any time, a model that is familiar to this community. A font working group or interest group, we tried twice to start a working group that would standardize EOT, and that basically failed. So we're having now another group, probably an interest group rather than a working group. That link there goes to the charter. And the idea of that is it will basically study the problem, say what are the missing pieces, what needs to happen, what needs to change in CSS3, what needs to change about embedded fonts. Do we need to start liaising with the ISO group that standardizes OpenType and asks for new stuff? There have been suggestions, for example, of a permissions table. There was a post a few weeks ago saying that there should be a new permissions table in OpenType, and that by default all fonts that don't have that table should be unusable on the web. Well, that's not going to work, but anyway, you can see that there's a variety of opinions. Yes, 2 minutes. Victory, you love me, yes? Okay, good, okay. 2 minutes, so just enough time then to show you this third thing. So this is some tests that are happening at W3C for embedded fonts, for downloadable fonts. And the extent to which they support more complex language features. It's going to skip Georgian because it's easy. Let's go on to Armenian. Hello. Okay, so the top one in the box is a downloaded font that's been downloaded from the W3C website and used. The next one is the same font installed, obviously with a different name, otherwise it'd be cheating. But it renders the same. The next level is a reference graphic to show you what it should look like, and then the bottom is the system default font, which in this case you can see is different. So that's Armenian script. That's using that font face. That's actually really trivial. That's Khmer. Now we've got a problem here. See the dotted circly thing? That shouldn't look like that. Should look like that. And similarly, the little pluses underneath, they shouldn't look like that. They should look like these little, I don't know what they're called actually, the bits that go underneath. It doesn't have them. So that's a problem. Whether it's a problem with this browser, the browser I'm using here is Firefox 3.5 beta 4. Whether it's a problem with that or whether it's a problem with the underlying Uniscribe or what the rendering system is not clear. But at least we're testing it, and then people can fight over whose job it is to fix it. That's also Khmer with the same problem, obviously. So there's Hindi, that's working correctly. And that's Arabic, which is working correctly again. There we are, that's where I copied the example that I used earlier. That's Urdu. And that's a mixture. So these fonts, we'll probably add more, but these tests, all using freely downloadable fonts, not Libre fonts, are available on the W3C website. So people who want to use this for regression testing and whatnot can feel free to use that. I guess I'm probably out of time, so I should just ask quickly for questions. Yes?
We can take a couple of questions.
Actually, a question about the comment about Pango. I had discussions about problems selecting fonts in Pango with Meetup, like I think some years ago, two or 3 years ago, and I think they are aware that there is a problem because, especially if you think about the C enums in the library to specify font line, for example, then you realize that there really is a problem. And I think they are aware of the problem. I'm not sure if they know where they want to go.
Okay.
Or so it might be necessary to come up with a proposal on how to solve this on API level.
Do you remember for the weight enums, are they just 100, 200, 300 like that? Because I don't know if you noticed that the...
I would have to look into the head.
Okay, because the example I gave with the 6 weights with Zalamander caps, the lightest one is 250. And then the next one's 300, and I suspect that's not going to fit into that structure.
I guess they even do use a number, but have a certain set of, font weight might be the wrong example. So I think there were some other things like styles where you have to define for small caps or stuff like this. And I noticed the problem myself in Inkscape because I bought a font where I have regular and semi-bold. And there comes another problem of Pango, that Pango tries to synthesize fonts not available anyways, not installed on your system. So if I have regular and semi-bold, I of course would like to use the semi-bold variant for when toggling the bold button, but in fact in the font listing in Inkscape I get like 5 fonts, which is like regular, semi-bold, bold, italic bold. And I'm not sure what I'm getting if I click on one of this. I'm pretty sure I don't really get semi-bold, actually. So that's a problem there, and I discussed this, but I don't know what they're currently standing at.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay.
Okay.